couple of years, racially motivated violence has been at the forefront of American news media. On April 17, 2023, McCurtain County Gazette News reporter Bruce Willingham caught 4 southern Oklahoma law enforcement officials complaining that it was no longer socially acceptable to hang black residents with a, quote, damned rope. The recording of County Sheriff Kevin McClarty, Commissioner Mark Jennings, Sheriff's Investigator Alicia Manning, and Jail Administrator Larry Hendricks discussing both long-standing police brutality and racially motivated violence led to the governor of Oklahoma calling for their resignation, but not before this southern Oklahoma town was placed in the international spotlight. To understand the overall meaning of this police department's nostalgia for lynching, it's important to place the history of lynching in a national context. Lynching is a specific form of racially motivated vigilante violence that plays a huge role in the history of American race relations. Hi, I'm Sydney O'Hare, a graduate student at the University of Iowa's Department of History, specializing in public memory of historical violence. As a preface, this video is not going to feature images of lynching victims. While these images are vital tools for historians, repeatedly showing images of the dead can accidentally continue violence against them. Instead, I want us to focus on the bystanders and perpetrators of lynching violence. In order to fully understand the history of lynching violence, it's important that we outline a clear definition of what we count as a lynching. The Association of Southern Women for the Prevention of Lynching defines lynching as evidence that a person has been killed at the hands of a group acting under the pretext of service to justice, race, or tradition. These 3 terms, justice, race, and tradition, are the core components of understanding lynching violence. They're pretty flexible and rely a lot on the context around them. Between 1877 and 1950, there were a documented 4,384 lynchings in the United States. This translates to roughly 1 person every week for 73 years. Some of the best data on lynching violence comes from the research done at the Tuskegee University Institute during the first half of the 20th century. Started by Monroe and Florence Work, Black academics have worked hard to collect data and catalog lynching violence. You can explore the work's data and ongoing collection at Plain Talk History, which is linked here in this video's description. Another important component of understanding the history of lynching is to differentiate between its myths and its facts. Perhaps one of the most prevalent myths about lynching is that it was exclusively a Southern problem. But we have documentation of lynching that occurred in states as far north as Minnesota, as east as New Jersey, and as west as Washington. While the highest concentration of lynchings happened in the Deep South, lynching needs to be understood as a national issue. While it's fair to examine why the South had a higher number of lynchings, we can't only focus on one region. Another key part of understanding lynching violence is understanding why it occurred. Keeping in mind the importance of justice, race, and tradition, the why is just as vital as the where. Lynching violence is different than other forms of violence because of its emphasis on social norms, which in this case prioritize white supremacy as a core part of the social hierarchy. People who were victims of lynchings were seen as breaking the social order, and violence was used to keep them in a specific social place. This emphasis on social context is a key part of understanding lynching culture and comes back to the idea of tradition. When people, particularly Black people, broke from social traditions created and upheld by white supremacy, they were met with violence. We have documentation of lynchings that killed people of all ages and genders, showing us how much this emphasis on white supremacy in the social order shaped life. In 1918, Mary Turner was 8 months pregnant when she was hanged from a Georgia bridge after speaking publicly about her husband's lynching the day before. Elizabeth Lawrence, a Black teacher, was lynched in Jefferson County, Alabama in 1933 for scolding a group of white schoolchildren. At least 700 white men, women, and children lynched 15-year-old Ernest Collins and 16-year-old Benny Mitchell in Colorado County, Texas in 1935 following a murder accusation. Emmett Till was only 14 years old when he was lynched in Money, Mississippi in 1955 by Roy Bryant, J.W. Millam, and Leslie Millam. Mamie Till, Emmett's mother, spent the rest of her life as a civil rights activist trying to get justice for her young son. When Rosa Parks was asked about the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott later that year, she said that Till's murder played a key role in her position as an activist. During the 1964 Mississippi Freedom Summer, lynching was again thrust into the national spotlight with the murders of activists Andrew Goodman, James Earl Chaney, and Michael Schwerner. Goodman and Schwerner, two white Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee volunteers, and local activist Chaney were murdered by the KKK in Philadelphia, Mississippi, after trying to organize rural black voters. When studying the variety of people who were victims of lynching, we see how social order impacted their murders. White supremacy crops up in everything from large-scale politics to regulating how people interact while walking down the street, meaning lynching violence could be used to uphold larger social hierarchy based on all types of interactions. Lynching culture also assured that the legal system would protect perpetrators, meaning that white supremacy and cultural practices could use violence without consequence. While we have a clear record of the murders of women and children in lynching culture, a significant portion of lynching victims were black men. Black men were targeted for reasons ranging from petty crimes to violence against white employers, but some of the most famous and violent causes of lynching occurred when black men were accused of sexual violence against white women. An example you're probably familiar with is the fictional court case in Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, where lawyer Atticus Finch defends Tom Robinson from a rape accusation from a white woman. White female sexuality was seen as a key part of maintaining white supremacy, and anxieties about interracial sex were abound by the beginning of the 20th century. Black men were portrayed in media as sexually barbaric, motivated by lustful and animalistic urges to ruin white women. White men, therefore, were seen as justified in using violence to protect, defend, or seek revenge on behalf of the women they wanted to protect. While these stereotypes had long roots in slavery, they continued to permeate the mainstream American culture with movies like Birth of a Nation in 1915 and the huge growth of the KKK in the 1920s. Today, stereotypes about black men and boys as particularly dangerous impact everything from suspensions in school to prison sentencing. It's important to note that the fear of interracial sex between black men and white women did not transfer to fears about white men and black women. Whereas protecting white women was seen as vital to maintaining social order, black women were longtime survivors and activists against sexual violence by white men. But this topic itself is a whole other video. For more about gender, violence, sexuality, and race, check out this video's description for other readings. While there is no doubt that the accusations of sexual violence were a huge factor in lynching culture, we don't want to see sexual violence as the only reason for lynching. From a historical perspective, it just isn't true. But from a social perspective, not acknowledging the variety of ways lynching culture was justified by bystanders and perpetrators is in itself a form of violence. Flattening the story of lynching into one only based on sexual violence and revenge accidentally allows stereotypes about black men being animals, white women needing to be saved, and white men as protectors to continue into the modern day. It also means we forget the stories of black women and children who were lynched, not allowing us to see the huge scale of violence that lynching culture fostered. Another core part of lynching culture is the massive resistance movements black artists and activists mounted against it. Perhaps the most famous crusader against lynching was Ida Wells Barnett. Wells Barnett began her activism as a journalist and was forced to flee Tennessee after writing about the lynching of 3 of her friends. Writing from Chicago, Wells Barnett was quick to point out the myth of the black rapist in lynching culture, leading the way for other journalists, academics, and activists to study lynching as both a social and political problem. Today, many historians consider Wells Barnett to be one of the most influential women in American history. Billie Holiday's haunting vocals in her song Strange Fruit left black and white audiences alike captivated, and was named the most influential song of the 20th century by Time magazine. Jacob Lawrence conveyed the isolation and pain felt by families of lynched people in his series on the Great Migration. Students, especially at historically black colleges and universities, often protested continuous violence and rallied in favor of federal efforts to prevent lynching. The NAACP hung this famous flag outside of their New York headquarters with each new reported lynching, showing a consistent effort to draw attention to lynching culture at a national level. These various resistance efforts lasted from the end of Reconstruction in 1877 until they were absorbed into the larger civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. While efforts to prevent and punish lynching permeated black culture in the 20th century, 2 different federal anti-lynching bills failed to pass the Senate due to Southern opposition. It wasn't until President Biden signed the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act of 2022 that lynching was officially made a federal hate crime. Today, communities and organizers have undertaken a variety of ways to both document and to come to terms with lynching violence. The Equal Justice Initiative's National Memorial for Peace and Justice aims to document every case of lynching in the U.S., giving descendants of lynching victims a place for both grief and solidarity. The EJI also works with local communities who want to document lynching violence on a smaller scale, allowing local activists a place in a larger national narrative. Within local communities themselves, new efforts are being made to not only remember victims of violence, but also to ask how hundreds of people could perpetuate violence in the first place. But the secret recordings of a small-town sheriff's department are not the beginning of modern lynching violence. In February of 2023, neo-Nazis protested the opening night of Parade, a Broadway show about the lynching of Jewish American Leo Frank in 1913 for the alleged murder of a young white girl. While criminal justice experts and historians all agree that Frank was innocent, the National Socialist Movement's protest spoke to the ongoing anxieties about social place, sexuality, race, and ethnicity. But the continuous nature of lynching culture is best encompassed in the murder of Ahmaud Arbery on February 23, 2020. The men who murdered Arbery were not arrested for 3 months and were only pursued after footage of the lynching was widely publicized on social media. While all 3 men were found guilty of federal hate crime charges last year, Ahmaud Arbery's murder serves as a stark reminder that lynching violence still haunts American culture and has very real impacts. Lynching culture can only exist with people ready to act on it. Perpetrators and bystanders not only continued lynching culture to force Black Americans into the social order of white supremacy, but also to teach white children about the acceptability of violence. Witnesses kept pieces of victims' bodies, sections of ropes, and graphic photographs as souvenirs. People happily wrote to distant family about their experience witnessing lynching violence. There is no clear, set way to think about how lynching culture developed in American history. Justice, race, and tradition are all very pliable terms, each serving a different purpose in both perpetuating and healing from violence. What does it mean when a whole town not only allows violence to happen, but revels in it? What responsibilities do the descendants of perpetrators have? Is there a way for a whole culture to atone for a sin? And in the words of Saidiya Hartman, how might we understand mourning when the event has yet to end? This video was adapted from a lecture presented at the University of Iowa in the spring of 2022. For more information about the history of violence and gender, check out Crystal Feemster's Southern Horrors and Danielle McGuire's At the Dark End of the Street. For more on the Mississippi Freedom Summer, see David W. Hawk's Black Bodies in the River. If you're interested in how communities remember lynching violence, check out the Equal Justice Initiative's memorial and museum web pages. Special thanks to Dr. Ashley Howard for her academic, presentation, and writing guidance on this research and lecture production.